Luchesius was quite a businessman. He knew the wheelings and dealings of the world, and he knew exactly how he could make a good buck, and he really didn't care how he made it. He kind of liked to do things underhandedly and kind of knew how to work the system, and he was quite shrewd. He really had no sense of justice as his greed took hold of him. Any means necessary to get more money he took. He was not a good man. Even though he was living in an Italian neighborhood in the 12th century, some things never change. He and surrounded by good Catholics around him, he himself could care less for the gospel, could care less for the faith, and he cared most about making money and making more money. They say about getting rich is when you get rich, you never have enough. And so he never had enough, and any means necessary to get more was just fine with him. He married a woman who had the same disposition as he did. She enjoyed his wealth, bona donna, and she wanted to be as wealthy and would encourage him in his illegal affairs and getting finances and money and so forth, and they became quite wealthy. Again, they were walking in the darkness of the greed. Greed had become for him a cloud that was blocking the sun. The cloud of his greed would not allow the grace of God to fall upon him. He could care less for the needs of the poor. He could care less about the needs of those around him. It was all about him. Something happened one day. Luchesius began to think about the reality of death. He had all this wealth, all this property, all these things, but he began to reflect upon what really happens to his soul after he dies. What would become of all of his riches when he dies? He did all this. And where would it go? And what did it really gain him in the end when his body would be lowered into the dirt? And it brought him to a deep conversion of life. As he began to reflect upon the truth of life and death and the reality of the fact that one day he would have to stand before God and give an account of his life, that cloud of greed began to dissipate. Charity fell upon him and his heart was changed. He convinced his wife that they had to change and stop doing this type of work. They both, together as a married couple, realized that they did need to change their lives. They need to turn over to the Lord and get rid of this greed of theirs. And they started to straighten out their illegal financial business dealings and start doing things on the up and up. But in the midst of that, they also realized how selfish and self-centered they had become. They had no children and everything was just about themselves. And not only did they turn from greed, but they began to help the poor around them. Luchesius began himself to grow in deep prayer and deep union with God. And the more he grew in union with God, the more that cloud of greed began to dissipate and the more the sunshine of the charity and love of God would fall upon him. And his heart began to swell with true love of God and true love of the poor. And he realized one day that he needed to make restitution for all of his horrible crimes of greed and stealing and so forth. And that the money he had acquired, particularly the way he acquired it, really was not his. And so, sectioning off a piece of land of his property for he and his wife, where they could live off the land, setting up a garden, he then, with her agreement, took all their money and distributed it to the poor. And he began to live as a man who served the poor and lived by the sweat of his brow in hard work and labor in reparation for all of his horrible crimes of thievery and but horrible sin of greed. He also, when he did this, he was also reflecting upon the fact that he was such a greedy person and greed was still there in his heart that he knew if he kept this stuff, it would be such a temptation to go back to the old ways and start doing things the way he used to do it. And so that was one of his reasons to stop it, was to get rid of the money so he wouldn't go back to his old ways. He knew he had to get rid of that temptation. And the only way to do that was to separate himself completely from that old way of life. he and his wife began to live good, holy, prayerful lives, attending daily Mass, praying together. And one day he went to church, and this young, rather strange-looking creature showed up to preach in the pulpit. A rather short preacher, not so good-looking, in a raggedy brown robe. And he began to preach on the love and the mercy of God and on penance and turning one's life back to the Lord and the need to truly love the Lord. And so after the sermon, Blessed Luchesius went up to Brother Francis and invited him to his house to speak to him about how he could better serve the Lord. And there, Blessed Luchesius, St. Francis, and his wife Bonadonna talked about Francis's plan to create for the laity a type of society, a religious order where lay people could follow a particular rule of life so that they can grow in holiness. Luchesius and his wife Bonadonna were the first members of the Third Order of St. Francis, known today as the Secular Franciscans. They received a tunic without a hood, they put a cord on them, they lived lives of penance and prayer and received the rule that St. Francis wrote for them. And from those two grew the incredible gift of the Third Order of St. Francis, which extends throughout the entirety of the world now. But Luchesius and Bonadonna persevered so beautifully in their life of really living and serving as lay people in the world, following a rule of life of prayer and penance and service to the poor. This beautiful holy couple. Luchesius wept bitterly, although he was overjoyed. It was kind of a mix of emotions. He wept bitterly when he lost Bonadonna, and yet he rejoiced because he knew, because of their life of penance together and the life of prayer, she received the glory of the kingdom of heaven. And the day of judgment for her before the Lord was a day of joy when she entered the kingdom of heaven. He would live on much longer than her. He'd live on to the year 1260, died 80 years old, of a holy life of a man who was once so filled with greed and selfishness and became such a man of great charity and kindness. No longer a deceiver for his greed, but truly a man living in virtue and holiness to promote the beautiful charity of God. It's a beautiful story of a husband and wife who started out in life greedy, selfish, self-centered, and ended up as blesseds of the church. The key moment of their life was that moment where they encountered the ever-living God and realized that he deserved everything of theirs. So beautifully. We don't often talk about husband and wives who've been canonized together, and perhaps we need to speak more about them. That husbands and wives are to help each other reach the glory of the kingdom of heaven. That their mission to each other is to help one another gain holiness of life, to encourage each other to live in virtue, to rid oneself of vice. Just recently we had the beatification of the parents of Saint Therese. Her parents were beatified saints. These two today are one of those couples of history who understood the fact that God was calling both of them to holiness, and they had to encourage each other to do so. They had the humility to listen to the other when the other told them where they needed to grow in holiness, where they were lacking in virtue. Not easy in marriage, we know that. And they accepted what the other shared with them, and they encouraged each other to persevere. Thanks be to God they had St. Francis to help them, but they themselves had already been on that path before they met Francis. So today we think about and we ask the intercession of Blessed Luchesius and his wife, Blessed Bonadonna, and ask their assistance, that they would intercede for us to obtain for us the grace to truly live holy lives, and to pray for marriages, that husbands and wives will help each other to become the saints that God desires them to be. May God bless you, and Mary keep you.